Hi everyone, welcome to your week 6 reading guide for ENVI 211. We're going to be talking about food resources this week, and as usual I'm going to try to make this relatively brief so you don't have to listen to this forever. The PowerPoint is posted on Blackboard, so if you can't see the text at the very bottom of the screen, refer to that PowerPoint and it should be able to let you look at that directly. Okay, so the first part of your chapter this week talks a lot about human population and food, trying to tie this topic into last week's topic about human population. And some of the topics and terms I want everyone to think about are food security versus insecurity. If you're food secure, you know where your next meal is coming from and you're secure in your ability to put it on your family's table. If you're food insecure or you experience food insecurity, you typically don't have enough to eat, or the food that you are finding to eat may not be of particularly high quality. In this country, we refer to places even in our big cities that are food deserts, where perhaps the only thing within walking distance where you'd be able to buy food is a little corner grocery store with primarily packaged and processed food, so candy bars and chips and soda and things like that are not very good for you. And so if that's your only option, chances are your security in being able to put a good meal on your family's dining room table is not very high. And that can be a form of food insecurity. Also, food insecurity can come from just not having enough money to buy food of any kind to eat, or not being able to access food of any kind. That food insecurity often results in chronic undernutrition or chronic malnutrition. If you're not sure what the difference between those two is, undernutrition is not having enough to eat, basically not enough calories, and that usually results in a lot of hunger. It's particularly bad for children because it stunts their development. Chronic malnutrition is having potentially enough to eat, but not having enough nutrients in the food that you eat, and that happens even in this country in those areas I've described as food deserts. So this can happen up to 1 billion people globally. 1 out of 7 people experiences one of these conditions. Up to 6 million children die per year, and most of these conditions occur in places like sub-Saharan Africa, parts of India, parts of Southeast Asia, where there are typically a lot of people and not a lot of resources to go around. But as I said, chronic malnutrition can happen even in this country, in a place that you would think would have plenty of food for everybody. And this can often be related to food transportation issues, food networks. Even here in Alaska, we have some issues over food insecurity being at the end of the food transport network. The flip side is overnutrition, and this is really a problem of too much consumption, and 1.6 billion people globally are sort of overnutrition suffering, and that can result in obesity and heart disease and some chronic diabetes, some chronic diseases that affect people in a negative way because they eat too much food or they eat too much of the wrong food. Why is this an environmental science issue? Well, because we need land and other resources on which to grow food, so our ability as a planet to grow our food is limited. And yet if we have this uneven distribution of people who are eating too much versus people who are not getting enough to eat, we could solve this issue of not having enough land to grow food on by having a better distribution of our food resources. Okay, moving on. 38% of the Earth's surface is agriculture. What do we grow? Mostly pulses, things like corn, rice, wheat, potatoes, soybeans, and the quantities of those grown vary, of course, by country and by region based on climate. What we have seen over time, and that's what this graph right here shows, is that the number of species of these different plants that form the basis of our food chain have decreased through time through the process of selective breeding. So we have far fewer varieties, say, of tomatoes that grow well today than we did historically. 408 species of tomatoes a century ago, 79 species or breeds of tomato today. So through the process of agriculture, we're decreasing the plant diversity of the plants that are grown commonly for food. 50% of the Earth's surface, and this is terrestrial surface for both of these, agriculture and rangeland. 50% of the Earth's surface is rangeland. That is what we use to grow livestock on. And 30% of the Earth's surface is arid rangeland, which is very vulnerable to overgrazing because there's not enough water typically to support lush regrowth of vegetation. We can really break agriculture down into two types of agriculture. Most of our food system is based on industrialized agriculture, which is typically characterized by monocultures, heavy use of mechanized and motorized farm equipment, conglomeration of livestock into small areas for fastest breeding and growth, and then the use of fertilizers and chemical pesticides to minimize the damage done by pests and also increase crop yields. Subsistence agriculture, on the other hand, is much more based on food products as being part of the ecosystem. It can also be destructive, certainly if you have too many livestock grown in a single area, or, for example, slash and burn agriculture as a way to clear areas for subsistence harvest can be have detrimental impacts on ecosystems. But subsistence agriculture is much more traditional and tends to be more small scale than industrialized agriculture. Some of the characteristics that we see in industrial agroecosystems are that ecological succession is halted, right? We grow a crop of plants, it comes to fruition, to ripening, and we harvest whatever that plant is, and that takes the succession back to bare ground again. Biodiversity and food chains are simplified through this process. If you're growing things in a monoculture, one species grown at a time, which is the next bullet point down, then you don't have a lot of biodiversity in that cropland, and you also don't have a lot of food chain activity, right? The only thing that you're going to find in a monoculture is something that would directly eat that plant, and it's typically going to be some kind of pest species. And because crops in monocultures are planted in rows and fields, we see this type of agriculture as being vulnerable to pests. Many agricultural systems require plowing as a way to get rid of the residue from the previous year's crop, get the soil ready for this year's crop, and add nutrients and fertilizer into the soil. However, plowing is a pretty unnatural soil disturbance. In fact, some people have called it the biggest disturbance to our ecosystems on the planet, because there's no other time that the soil is actually pulled up, turned over, and disturbed in the same way that plowing creates. And of course, because you're moving plants out of that system every harvest, all of the nutrients that have been moved into the plant tissues get removed from the system every harvest too, which is one of the reasons why fertilizer is so necessary in industrial agriculture. Industrial agriculture really developed in the middle of the 20th century as an attempt to overcome environmental constraints, which is always the case with agriculture. Even subsistence agriculture needs to overcome environmental constraints in order to grow enough food to feed people. But the Green Revolution was really an attempt to deal with food shortages that were being seen in many developing countries. So engineers and agricultural specialists devised high-yield wheat and rice products that basically could get a lot more food energy out of a single hectare or acre of crop. And it required intensive cultivation through fertilizer, pesticides, mechanized machinery, irrigation, and hybrid seeds, hormones and antibiotics for livestock. But the net result was that food production doubled in the mid-20th century. One of the issues of the Green Revolution was that, yes, we increased crop production, but we also increased the footprint of agriculture on our planet. So we needed more energy to produce a crop. So gasoline for tractors, petroleum products for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, land degradation and habitat fragmentation to grow food on the scale that's required to take advantage of the higher yields, And then many hybrid seeds are developed by corporations like Monsanto that have patent rights, and so those hybrid seeds cannot be replicated in the wild. You have to continually buy seeds from Monsanto if you want to continue to grow that high yield crop. So making developing nations dependent on these imported seeds and food supplies, as well as all of the other things that are required to grow those high yield crops, has resulted in tremendous domination of the industry by just a few companies and a reliance of some small scale farmers on very expensive technologies, which has not been great for stability across the globe. Most importantly, from an environmental science perspective, industrialized agriculture can lead to soil problems, and this comes in the form of soil erosion, nutrient depletion, salinization, and finally desertification. And chapter 14 in your book covers this pretty clearly. Because the key to growing food crops is really healthy soil. And soil, of course, is the uppermost layer of the Earth's crust. It supports all of the plants, animals, and microbes that make up a healthy ecosystem and basically allows there to be pore space for nutrients and water into which plant roots grow down and are able to tap into those resources they need to grow bigger and stronger. So if we don't have healthy soil, we don't have the ability to grow crops with as high yield as they could possibly realize. And we know from week 2 of this class that soil is key for nutrient cycling, which enables nutrients to be available to crop plants. So without healthy soil, you get this process of salinization of soil, particularly from agricultural water, and also desertification, which can lead to the soil not being able to support any plant life. And this is particularly true of sub-Saharan Africa, where the areas right on the edges of the Sahara Desert area are rapidly desertifying and becoming unsuitable to support any crops whatsoever. So really, I wanted to make sure everybody can think about this as sort of the global challenge being two-pronged in terms of agriculture and food resources. One is producing enough food to feed a growing population of people, and you can see in this graph here, the red line is the world total in wheat supply, and the blue line is the per capita, per person wheat supply. And you can see that right around the year 2000, those two diverged, and the per capita wheat supply started to dip below the world total, meaning that it started to decrease, meaning that now we're on a trajectory where each additional person added to the planet has less to eat than they did previous to the year 2000. To meet our growing population, our global food production is going to need to increase by 70% by the year 2050 to meet our needs. How are we going to do that? And then, of course, everybody's seen this Gapminder graph software before or website before, but in this case, what I'm showing here is the relationship between food supply on the x-axis and infant mortality. You can see it's just a decreasing trend. So as food supply per person decreases, as is shown in this graph, likely our infant mortality rate is going to go up. And if that happens, we're sort of reversing the demographic transition and going back to a point where we may see higher birth rates to try to compensate for that. Another global challenge is producing enough food to meet the increasing standard of living that many developed countries and countries far along the demographic transition are experiencing. So you can see that meat consumption here in China versus the US. China is just growing exponentially in terms of meat consumption because they're developing, they want a high standard of living, and people are moving from eating a mostly vegetarian rice-based diet to eating a mainly meat-based diet. Obviously, the Western Hemisphere has a much higher intake of meat consumption, as shown in these dark red areas, but places like Asia, China, Russia are starting to catch up, and that poses a risk for the security of our food system, and that eating meat is a much less efficient way to feed our population, right? Because a lot of vegetables, a lot of crops have to go into feeding those animals, and those animals convert that energy much less efficiently into their own tissues, which we then eat. It's that second law of thermodynamics, right? All energy transfer through trophic levels is inefficient. And that explains why vegetarian diets are easier on the environment. So really the question is, how do we keep increasing agricultural production? There's two routes we can sort of take. The route most of the globe is going is this mechanized agriculture using technology. It improved yield crops, low water crops, but you also need a high demand for resources. Hydroponics fits in here, which can be really good in dry areas, but you do need a lot of resources. This method also requires fertilizers, pesticides, and hormones, all of which have negative environmental side effects, and of course involves genetic engineering, which your book talks about in detail. The other option is resource-based agriculture using biotechnology, and this method tries to recognize resource limits and keep agriculture sustainable. It places emphasis on maintenance of soil fertility and integrated pest management, such that the first line of defense against pests is not always chemicals, sometimes biological control, sometimes mechanical removal, and as a last resort, gentle on the environment as possible, pesticide application. Focuses on crop rotation in part to stymie pest invasions, no-till agriculture to reduce the dependence on plowing that has destructive characteristics for the soil, and then really because of the focus on maintenance of soil fertility, the idea that soil conservation, trying to prevent erosion and salinization and removal of soil from other means as minimal as possible. It's not quite clear where organic fits in there, and this is a topic of pretty good debate in that it's just not possible at this point to feed everyone on the planet through strictly organic means, as organic is defined in this country. So really, I personally think that where we need to be going is through more local control of food production, minimizing transport of food for long distances, and more small-scale farming, such that you can go down the street, walk down the street, and buy the food that you need from farmers who live in your area and whose crops are suitable for that particular set of environmental conditions. Okay, almost done here. I wanted to mention aquaculture as a sort of a farming of fish concept. Aquaculture really is more like agriculture on land than it is like wild caught fisheries such as salmon, drift nuts, or our sport fisheries for, say, halibut or rockfish. It's the fastest growing type of food production. It's not new, it's been invented across the world many times, and it's an excellent source of protein, but it certainly has these risks, and your book talks about many of these. Eutrophication, overfishing, low trophic level fish to feed higher value farm fish, the same problem as livestock, consuming crops at a rate that is inefficient, disease transfer, chemicals such as antibiotics and antifoulants to deal with the waste that is produced in aquaculture, biodiversity issues, escaped farm species could compete or interbreed with other species, and then, of course, land conversion. The book talks about particularly the loss of biodiverse mangrove forests in tropical areas that are being cut down for aquaculture. From a perspective of this state, we get a lot of revenue and have a lot of notoriety for our wild salmon populations. Salmon consumption is growing incredibly fast, and it's the fastest growing aquaculture market as well. Farm salmon are now 70% by weight of the salmon market. And so basically the concern is, from an Alaska perspective, if all we eat as a population, as a society, is farmed salmon, does that mean there will be less interest in maintaining wild salmon stocks and habitats here in the state of Alaska? So we have to think about what aquaculture means both globally and on a regional basis. All right, I'll leave that there. I guess this one was a little longer than I anticipated, but hopefully it's been useful, and I hope you enjoy this topic.